and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Vogue magazine and representation. This video is particularly relevant to you if you are studying the Eduqas Exam Board A-Level Media Studies, because Vogue is one of the optional set texts on the Component 2 exam paper. Not all schools study Vogue as a magazine option for this exam, so please don't panic if you don't, but I do have other videos on my channel for Huck, Woman's Realm and The Big Issue. The front cover of Vogue magazine features Sophia Loren, who was very famous in the 60s for being a very kind of exotic beauty. She was kind of held up as being a very beautiful role model for women. So featuring her here looking very glamorous and exotic, and she seems very rich and wealthy. You know, she's got jewels on and beautiful clothes. Certainly it makes her feel very exotic. It feels like a kind of like Turkish dancer, you know, her costume and things like that represent her in that way. And you could talk about how that represents her as kind of other, and it might be useful to look at Stuart Hall for understanding that. I do have a video about that on my channel, but it's that idea of creating these exotic representations of other cultures. In the financial article that is inside Vogue, they have some quite counter-typical representations of women in places. So they interview a woman who is or works for the Financial Times, called Sheila Black, and she's very much represented in a position of power. You know, she talks about women being financially independent, you know, wanting to invest money and having kind of financial power. And this was really quite unusual for its time. You know, in the 1960s, women legally didn't actually have that much power for the most part. It was starting to change. We were getting the influx of, you know, second wave feminism. And so there were starting to become these kind of shifts in the way gender was treated in society. But this would have been quite unusual for the time and quite counter-typical in relation to a lot of other mainstream magazines. It might reflect the class and financial status of the typical readers of Vogue. Women who were reading Vogue at that time and who are reading Vogue now tend to be more wealthy, and so you know, talking about them having money to invest, whilst it might be counter-typical in terms of gender, it might absolutely represent the fact that they were wealthier and so were more likely to have their own finances and their own money. Although the fact that they have to have an article at all explaining to women all these key words and basically treating them like they don't understand finances might suggest and reflect this idea that it was still a very new thing for women to know anything about what was happening with their household finances. Previously, it was always their fathers or their husbands that would have dealt with this. So the fact that they're having to explain in quite simplistic terms what it means to invest money and what different investment opportunities there are is very reflective of you know, the way women were being treated in society at the time. And certainly it represents women as not being completely independent yet. You know, it talks about women relying on their husbands quite a lot. It talks about women having a lack of privacy from their husband and their husband still being very much involved in financial affairs. And so reflecting this idea that perhaps married women were certainly still quite reliant on their husbands at the time. There are some fairly conventional representations of women in the rest of the magazine. You know, Van Zunen says that women are either represented as domestic or sexualised, and you can see this in a lot of the rest of the pages. In the Q-Tex advert, you've got a woman who kind of appears to be naked, so no clothes, and it even uses phrases that seem to suggest nudity, so the bare essentials, birthday suit, barely decent. These are the names of the colours that this lipstick comes in, so very much you know, suggestive of being naked, and it even says, like, are you woman enough? So asking this rhetorical question, this idea that you need to be naked and beautiful and sexualized to be feminine, to be a real woman. So very reflective of the way in which women were represented in the media and the way in which women still are often represented even in modern magazines. In the Revlon advert as well, we're seeing very similar representations. Women are called alluring and beguiling. This idea that you're supposed to be there to attract, those words that are about attracting somebody. So it's very much suggesting that your appearance and what other people think of you and how they respond to your looks is highly important. In the imperial leather advert, we see a mother and son. And again, this is a fairly typical representation of women being domestic and maternal. You know, this idea that women were there to become parents and to have children. And the way she's holding him, it very much suggests that she is caring and gentle and loving. And because it's talking about soap and the softness on your skin, this representing this idea that women need to be soft and gentle. And so very reflective of that more domestic and maternal stereotype that we're so used to seeing in the media around women, particularly in this historical time period. Women are represented as domestic in the picnic articles and fashion pages as well. You know, they're holding children, nurturing them, you know, feeding them. It's that idea that women are passive, you know, they're not doing anything, they're lounging around in those photos. It feels quite romantic, but it also feels like this idea that, you know, we don't really see women taking any action in these pages. They are just modelling clothes, laying back, holding children. So very passive representations of women. And again, even though, I mean, this was the 60s, so obviously things were different, but it's important to remember that the 60s was changing, you know, society was changing, women were becoming more powerful. And yet this magazine, only really the financial page seems to suggest this. The rest of the pages are still quite old-fashioned in terms of the way gender is represented. And that might be because this was quite a mainstream magazine, and it might also be because you know, higher class women had less pressure on them to go out to work, whereas more lower class women, their families needed the money, so when they could work they did, whereas perhaps richer households, the women were still taking on more traditional roles of staying at home, looking after the children. The fact that Vogue magazine features women with children is very reflective of the time period as well, because don't forget, now Vogue magazine has very little about children and childcare because many women are delaying having children until later in life. Whereas in Vogue in the 60s, it was very common that the women that they were targeting would already be married and have children because people were getting married earlier at a younger age. So the representations of women being mothers is absolutely representative of the historical context. It's very obvious that class and the upper class is being represented far more in this magazine than sort of lower classes. So you know, there's quite complex language going on. There's the article, like the fashion pages that are kind of like picnics and talking about picnicking, and you can see that the costumes, it's very formal clothing. You know, the fact that they're talking about lords and ladies, and they mention Queen Victoria and famous artworks. It's this very much representing, you know, quite upper class, cultured women as being the focus, and as of being idealised, and that being the right way to be. And that's reflective, I guess, of the people that generally buy Vogue magazine. They do tend to have more money. The magazine itself is quite expensive, and the brands they promote are quite expensive. So perhaps reflecting the target audience as being from that sort of A-B social economic group. The representations of ethnicity in these magazine pages is quite interesting. So if you look at the white models that are in the magazine, a lot of the white models in the magazine are pictured in jewels, in luxury clothing, and so therefore are kind of represented as being quite high powered, quite high status, and perhaps having more money. Being of a kind of paler or whiter skin tone is normalised. If you look at the Q-Tex lipstick advert, and this is supposed to be nude range of colours, so it's supposed to be very neutral, like skin tone almost. And if you look at the actual range of colours that are available, it's very clear that these colours were made primarily for women with whiter skin tones. These nude tones are not you know, made for women with darker skin, and obviously that's kind of reflective of this kind of historical context in the, you know, early to middle 20th century, where a lot of media products were aimed primarily at white audiences. You know, Britain was a less diverse place, and certainly a less inclusive place, and so it's kind of reflecting the social cultural context of the way ethnicity was dealt with at the time in Britain. If you have a look at some of the other fashion pages, there are some ethnic minority people in them. So there's like the kind of black Egyptian men in one page, but they are marginalised in the position in the fashion pages. They're in the background of the shots, and they very much seem like the staff. and they are seen working and doing deals and things, whereas the woman is kind of dancing and enjoying leisure time. This idea that they are perhaps represented as poorer, whereas the white people are represented as having a higher status financially. So the leisure time, the white models in the picnic article are kind of lounging around in their leisure time and not having to actually work, whereas the non-white models used in the backgrounds are doing their everyday tasks and jobs. So still very much that post-colonialist representation of ethnicity. The way that they are positioned and the way that the focus is on the women in the clothes, it feels like the white models are, the kind of customers, the ones with power, and that these black men are like the employees that are there to kind of be her servants or bring her things. So, reflecting quite a post-colonialist representation of ethnicity, which would have been reflective of those 1960s. The white man is in a suit and he's writing. It's this idea that he looks perhaps more professional. So, it's not just about gender. It's this idea that, the white men and women are seen in positions of power and luxury and status, and non-white models are backgrounded, seen as other and seen as less important, certainly in the pages. So that was my easy to understand guide to Vogue magazine and representation. Please check out my channel and hit subscribe for more videos that might be useful for you for A-level media studies. And don't forget, if there's a video that you would like that I don't already have on my channel, please just leave a comment below.